you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Hang on, is it on?
No, it's going back to red and yellow again.
Isn't that special?
I will do this one.
You got it?
Can you hear me now? Yes. Awesome. Good morning.
Good morning.
I have a really good book for you today. This is called Cherry Pies and Lullabies by Lynn Reiser. And it's all about different generations of moms doing special things for their daughters. Chapter 1. Yes, there are chapters. Cherry pies, yes, good. My great-grandmother baked a cherry pie for my grandmother. My grandmother baked a cherry pie for my mother. My mother baked a cherry pie for me, and I baked a cherry pie for my bear. Every time it was the same, but different. Chapter 2, Flowers. My great-grandmother made a crown of flowers for my grandmother. My grandmother made a crown of flowers for my mother. My mother made a crown of flowers for me, and I made a crown of flowers for my bear. Every time it was the same, but different. This is a great chapter. Chapter 3, Quilts. My great-grandmother gave a quilt to my grandmother. My grandmother gave a quilt to my mother. My mother gave a quilt to me, and I gave a quilt to my bear. Every time it was the same, but different. Chapter 4, Lullabies. Notice how they're all wrapped up in their special quilts. My great-grandmother sang a lullaby to my grandmother. My grandmother sang a lullaby to my mother. My mother sang a lullaby to me, and I sing a lullaby to my bear. And every time it was the same. The end. Okay, Arlo is going to carry the lantern while we are sung out.
Good morning. Just gonna take 1 second here to get all set up.
Tracy,
Yeah.
there is a mirror.
Oh, look at that. Okay, so I can see, I'm a little bit short, but I can see the top of the slide and see where maybe I'm at. It's gotta recognize my face here. Oh, there we go. I'm gonna have like my copy down in front of me too. Thank you all for having me to come talk to you today. My talk is called Memory Feast, and as Walt said, it sort of explores the connection between food and poetry and memory. And I have this opening quote here. That perhaps by chance we have food images on the photos of the art in the back of the room as well. So Pablo Neruda said that we know poetry is like bread. It should be shared by all, by scholars and by peasants, by all our vast, incredible, extraordinary family of humanity. Prior to this is just an excerpt of the quote, but he also talks about how poetry is an art form that arose on every continent except Antarctica, right, of the globe, independently, right? Everybody has an oral poetry, oral storytelling tradition, and poetry is an art that has arisen everywhere. But also I did overhear some whispers of like, I don't understand poems all the time before I got started. So I just wanted to say, there's this really excellent quote that I want to say is by John Keats, but also it's actually screenwriters who wrote the movie Bright Starr, which is about the life of John Keats, who was a very, very famous romantic poet. You've probably been forced to read Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, Endymion, one of these things probably in school. And at least the script writers are totally copacetic with me. And in the movie, the actor playing John Keats says, "I still don't know how to work out a poem." And if John Keats doesn't know, we don't need to know. The actor then says, "A poem needs understanding through the senses. The point of diving into a lake is not immediately to swim to the shore, but to be in the lake, to luxuriate in the sensation of water. You do not work the lake out. It is an experience beyond thought. Poetry soothes and emboldens the soul to accept the mystery." And so I just want to say, if I read poems today and you're like, I don't really get that, that's fine. You don't need to get it. I think the worst thing that's ever been done to poetry is somebody said Robert Frost turned left in the woods. And like, that's not the point of Robert Frost's poem. Two roads diverged in a wood. It's not about answers. It's about better questions. It's about thinking deeply. And a poet is not a professor emeritus of whatever university. A poet is a professor of the five senses. That was said by the Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca. And I think if you have, senses about you, you don't even need all five, but that you are a poet because you are experiencing the world. And the point is not to have the answers. The point is to experience enough mystery and unknowing through poetry that it can make you brave for other unknowns. So, if John Keats didn't get it, we don't need to get it. The point isn't to have the answers, and certainly not to have the answers right away, but to experience the world through your senses, which is part of why I created this talk on food during the COVID still exists, but I started to journal the five senses every day. It might not be my deepest feelings. It was 5 fragments of my day. And I started to notice I would really start to pay attention to my cooking, because if I needed smell and taste and some of these other senses, I'd be like, oh gosh, like check out that papery feel of the garlic bulb. And then like, ooh, what can I compare that slippery feeling of the actual garlic to? the next slide. So those are the three, it'll be three poems that sort of go through those things. You'll also notice that I do have some slides up that we'll skip through because normally this talk is an hour, but today's talk's supposed to be 30 minutes. So one of the easiest things to skip is the little writing activities. But I do encourage you to, if you want to take a screenshot before they go away, you can pull out your smartphones and take a picture, or you can just take your handout home with you and think about writing your own poems about food. But that will be slides that we skip through in order to get through the whole program. So David, we're gonna go, see that? Those are the ones we're skipping. If you see the banana, we skip the bananas. And on to the next one is just my reminder to always say thank you to the Kansas Creative Arts Industries Commission for their Poet Laureate program. They're the ones who pay for my gas and my tolls and help me get around Kansas to do talks like this. And I'm really appreciative of the fact that they create this position, that they continue to foster this position. And Kansas has one of the most involved laureateship programs of most states. I know friends from other states where it's a very limited role. And I really appreciate that Kansas wants to have arts ambassadors and people doing this kind of work. So our first menu item, it's not even our amuse-bouche, it's really our starter, it's our appetizer, and it's poems about our how food in our relationship to ourselves. As I started to read lots of food and poetry anthologies and search keywords online and look for all these food poems about being alone, I really noticed some strong ties to certain subjects. There's this great quote by Lord Byron that said, "Since Eve ate apples, much depends on dinner." That's the next slide. David, that's the next slide. It's there it is. So I'm going to read, it's on the next slide, the first poem on the packet, August by Mary Oliver. And I want to, since y'all are practiced at like these kinds of like sermon-y type talks, I do this in other places. I almost went to divinity school instead of my poetry program. But I'm going to ask you all to read the final two lines of the poem when we get there. And David, if you want to advance the slide, the poem will also appear up there as well. So I will pause and I'll do like this gestural thing. This is like my only chance to be the minister I once wanted to be. So I'll do this thing and you all will read the last two lines. So I'll begin. August by Mary Oliver. When the blackberries hang swollen in the woods, in the brambles nobody owns, I spend all day among the high branches, reaching my ripped arms, thinking of nothing, cramming the black honey of summer into my mouth. All day my body accepts what it is. In the dark creeks that run by, there is this thick paw of my life, darting among the bells. Oops, no! In the dark creek that, I got so excited, I was in the middle of the sentence. In the dark creeks that run by, there is this thick paw of my life, darting among I'm going to get better at that. So we don't need to solve the poem. We're just in the lake of the poem. We're just experiencing the blackberries with Mary Oliver. But if I had to say things that I noticed about being in the lake of the poem, I notice things about, again, those senses. I always look for the senses of the poem. And food poems are so great for other senses. So often we think that poems have a lot of images, but how lovely that we get the taste. She calls it black honey. Talks about the feeling, the ripped arms, right? The price of getting to these berries is scratching up her arms. And then also seeing not just the berries, but the dark creek that runs by. So I also think that poems sort of operate on tensions. Fiction gets plot. They're the ones who are like, the dinosaurs are escaping their pens, or the tornado's coming. So they get those sort of like big, flashy conflicts. But poetry doesn't operate on a lot of conflict necessarily, but there's always tension that happens in language. So there's the sweetness of the black honey, but there's the ripped arms. There's being both deeply present in the act of gathering these sweet berries on land that nobody owns. But then there's also distraction. There's that creek that the thick paw of her life is coming next to her as she's in the middle of stealing these berries. So there's also the literal of like searching for the berries, and then there's that metaphor of that dark paw of her life. And I always feel like it's those tensions, it's those things that are pushing and pulling against each other that help give life to a poem. One of the things I try and fail a lot because it keeps me in practice. So every year I will start a new creative hobby. I always like to teach my students the origins of words, and one of my favorites is amateur. It doesn't mean one who sucks, it means one who loves. So sometimes when we say, oh, they're a real amateur at that, what we mean is they're somebody who just commits themselves with love to what they're doing. They might not be experts or super skilled, but they are one who loves what they do. So I try and pick up new hobbies all the time. And when I was learning watercolor, it sounds so silly to say that it was a big surprise for me, but we talked about the role of adding shadow and how something that was from 2 dimensions all of a sudden became 3. So this is one of my number one pieces of advice when I'm working with writers is what isn't there. Wallace Stevens has this great ending line to the poem, The Snowman, about the nothing that isn't there and the nothing that is. And what are the ways in which just a touch of what wasn't there before takes something from 2 dimensions to 3. So I think that's always important when you're looking around for good questions in a poem that they can give you, looking for what isn't there in order to give it more dimension. So there are other poems about pleasures of food that if you have, I do have some short packets out there, but if you have the longer packet, it has the poem One Bite by Amy Nezuko-Matadel, who's a Kansas poet. She now lives in Mississippi, but we still get to claim her because she grew up here for a while. And then the poem Going Wrong by Jack Gilbert. So David, on the next slide, we aren't going to read them together, but if poetry is about nourishment, you can take those home and read more poems about those foods if this appeals to you. But again, looking at the sensory details and the tensions of Amy Nezuko-Matadel's poem. But again, poems are not about answers, they're about what's the next good question. So the question that I get from reading Amy's poem is, what pleasure opened the world to me? Because she talks about this miracle fruit and how it just opened her up in a different way. So thinking about what is the food that opened the world to me, I have a whole story about a fig. So like just thinking about like the revelation that a fig was to me at one point, just thinking about what are the foods that revealed something about the world to you. In Jack Gilbert's Going Wrong, Jack has a conversation with God while he prepares a meal, and God's like, knock it off, man, with the solitude, go be among people. And Jack's like, no, I need to be greedy a little bit longer. And I think we often don't think about greed as the desire for one's own company, but this desire to revel in pleasures alone. But one thing that I found, all food poems that are about the self, those foods by people alone are usually pleasure foods. There's usually something about privacy and secrecy to it. And in this culture that's increasingly not private anymore, I find it really interesting to think about what are the foods I enjoy in private and why do I like that? What are those pleasures of picking berries and sneaking them? What are the pleasures of the chocolates I don't let my son know I have? What are those types of pleasures and why are they important to me? But there's a lot of delight, and I like thinking about, some people think solitude is a loneliness, and it can be, but especially when it's paired with food, so often those are poems of delight. So if, we'll go to the next slide, if anybody's like, I am already excited about making my own food poem, you can take a quick snap of that. But again, it's just questions. Anyway, if you want to nourish yourself through the writing of poems, one of the great things to do is read a stanza or two and ask a question to the side of it. And then read a stanza or two, write a question to the side of it. And then answer those questions for yourself. Like, where did I find this meal that is a rare pleasure? Who made it? Or off of what branch did I grab it? Or out of what bottle? What did it taste like? What pleasures besides taste did it have? What if any pain or hurt was there, or regret in this meal? So I think, again, whether the questions I give you or questions you ask yourself, questions are a great way to enter a poem. Robert Frost said, "No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader." And I think mystery is the great reason why I love poetry. When we have phones in our back pockets and can look up the answer, or just say, "Hey, Alexa, I just asked Alexa, what's the longest a dog has ever lived?" Because my son and his friend were debating this. And it's great. I can just I don't even have to pull out my phone. We have so many answers at our fingertips all the time. And facts are a way of being intimate with the world. But it's not the only thing, and it's not the only way to be in the world. And building up, you all practice this every week, but building up that tolerance for mystery and the unknown is so important, I think, to feeling satisfied in our lives, rather than needing all the answers and needing to be certain all the time. There's so little that we actually can feel certain about, ultimately, especially when it comes to some of the bigger things. All right, so we're going to go to the next slide, David, to our menu item number 2, thinking about food and how it guides our relationships with others. The poem I'm going to read, and that we're all going to read together, is a poem about a living other. But if you have the longer packet, the other 2 poems are about poems about those people who have gone, and food as memorial, which is very important to me. I have food traditions that I carry on that my mom started as a way to remember her on her birthday, on the holidays. Something about, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I have read that the olfactory sense in our brain is right next to the memory sense, which is why sometimes I'll just smell something and be like, Spain, why is Spain here? I'll just smell something and it'll just bring me back to a certain place. I smell New York sometimes. I smell things will just bring up my piano teacher. She just had a really popular perfume, I think, because just sometimes I'll be like, and then there I am. So smells, I think, are a great way if you want to bring back somebody that you've lost. Smell is a great way to do that. So most of these are kind of family poems. They can be friend poems, but the next slide has a quote by Oscar Wilde. I love Oscar. He said, "After a good dinner, one can forgive anybody, even one's own relatives." I really like the way food can be a healing thing for those we want to share a meal with. And on the next slide, this is not our poem, but this is just one of my favorite food poems that people also might have encountered or been forced to read in a class. This is just to say, "I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold." So again, that's sort of a privacy poem, right? Of eating a stolen food that's a pleasure. But in this case, you got to ask for forgiveness from the person who was saving those delicious plums. So the poem we're going to read together is not one of mourning, though again, there are poems of food and mourning in the packet if you want to think about that connection to food and those that we've lost. But this is a father who's still around. So this is Arabic Coffee by Naomi Shihab Nye. And we're going to do, instead of the last 2, you will do the last 3. I'm going to remember to pause this time. So where you see the italicized line, "You will live long enough," that's when you all read the last 3 lines together. So this is Arabic Coffee by Naomi Shihab Nye. "It was never too strong for us. Make it blacker, Papa, thick in the bottom. Tell again how the years will gather in small white cups, how luck lives in a spot of grounds. Leaning over the stove, he let it boil to the top and down again, 2 times, no sugar in his pot, and the places where men and women break off from one another was not present in that room. The 100 disappointments, fire swallowing olive wood beads at the warehouse, and the dreams tucked like pocket handkerchiefs into each day took their places on the table, near the half-empty dish of corn. and none was more important than the others, and all were guests. When he carried the tray into the room, high and balanced in his hands, it was an offering to all of them. Stay, be seated, follow the talk wherever it goes. The coffee was the center of the flower, like clothes on a line saying, nice. I give you like your coffee shop snaps. And so again, going to the next slide, it's not about what is the answer of the poem, there's no answer, but thinking about something about the language. There's something that is said. We start with the direct address to the dad of like, it's never too strong, Dad, just keep going back, make that coffee. But also there are things that are thought. There's the way food summons people to one another. The preparation of this coffee is an offering. It makes people stay. There's that make it happen again, tell again how the years will gather, how coffee is a ritual. And it is, right? Like so many of, I'm still drinking mine. It is a thing that gathers people. That's why there's like food out for fellowship. It's the way that is part of the gathering, part of the summoning of people together. And coffee is just one of my favorite rituals. I think it's a Johnny Cash quote. Somebody asked him about his definition of paradise, and he said, coffee with her. And I was like, same, Johnny. And so the tensions, right, there's past and there's present. There's the history of the ritual, there is the now. There's also what's not happening at the coffee, right? There's this like, all of these, the 100 disappointments, the fire that had been at the warehouse, there's all of the external to this table and this coffee offering, and then there's the present. Again, there's always a tension underlying a poem. There's both a celebration of this, and again, with that fire, there is a loss. There's always more than one thing happening at once. And particularly with emotion, gotta go back to Oscar. Oscar Wilde said, sentimentality is wanting the luxury of emotion without paying the price. And so I like to think about that of like, is my small human the greatest love I've ever known and completely perfect and the most wonderful little thing ever? Yes. Did I also not sleep for like 5 years? Yes. Did he throw up in my mouth? Yes. Of like, there is the great, amazing joy of something like that, but then there's also that, you know, the difficulty of not sleeping. The like wonderful joy and challenge of, you know, a little person who knows you very well and wants to push all of your buttons and knows them very well. Or like love stories. I say like a great long love story has a lot of taxes and laundry in it. It's not just the love songs on the radio, right? So thinking about how a poem of celebration also has some loss in it. And that there's sort of no getting around that all of that stuff is unified. All of our emotions are tied in with one another. So on the next slide is again, if you have the longer packet, in the Wendell Berry poem, it makes me ask the question, why do I assume relationships end because of death? Why can't my relationship continue to go on and even grow after? Reading with Eating Together by Lee Young Lee, the question I get is, how does continuing food traditions with those we've lost help our memory or even forgiveness, if that's what we still need from somebody who is gone? So if you do have the longer packet, I think those are great poems to check out. So then with the second recipe up there, if people want to grab that shot, you can. And again, it's just a list of questions after reading those poems that those questions give me. And again, questions are the core. You never have to know what direction Robert Frost turned in the woods or write a 5-paragraph essay on it for me. None of that is how I approach poetry. I think the more it makes you wonder, the more awe it can give you. Those are the things that we need from poetry. So our final poem is thinking about our relationship to the land, our relationship to seeds, to harvesting. A lot of these poems turn out to be gratitude poems when we think about the land and odes to things. But David, we can go to, and then we'll just go right along into our quote. This time by Paisley Rectal from her poem, The Pear. I'll eat what I like and throw the rest to the grasses. The seeds will find whatever soils they were meant for. And then the poem we're going to read together is Lucille Clifton's Cutting Greens. And again, it'll be the last 3 lines that you take on. I'll stop at roll black under the knife, and then you will read the last 3 lines. So Cutting Greens by Lucille Clifton. Curling them around, I hold their bodies in obscene embrace, thinking of everything but kinship. Collards and kale strain against each other, away from my kiss-making hand and the iron bed pot. The pot is black, the cutting board is black, my hand. And just for a minute, the greens roll black under my knife. Okay, so thinking about, again, the ingredients for the acquiring of food poems, the harvesting, the making, the planting, the language of personification of these greens is really interesting. I also think in the packet too, as it goes on, thinking about who does the labor of acquiring food and the tone that kind of gives the work. So Vespers is in the packet by Louise Glick, and it's really interesting because it's about failure and how like she's bad at tomatoes. And the next poem is called Sugar by Yusuf Komunyakaa, and it is about that disconnect between where we get our table sugar and who does the labor of harvesting sugarcane. These poems tend to be filled with both care and failure. Again, there's always a tension of things happening in a poem. They're poems of both optimism and disappointment, which often get paired together. So again, thinking about, normally food poems you think about as celebrations or perfections, but if you look at Vespers by Louise Glick, the question that I get is, how often do poems admit failure? Especially to or about plants, but kind of in general, how often are we willing to admit failure? And in Sugar, thinking about how often do we forget or feel disconnected from where our food comes from. And again, there's lots of really fun things in there because there's lots of cultural references. There's the music of Lead Belly. There's all of this other stuff going on. So as the recipe card comes up next, for those who want to take a picture, so David will get the banana back up there for the next slide, our banana slides. So if you want to take that picture and ask those questions of yourself later, thinking about a meal that you have harvested or purchased. I've totally read poems about 7-Eleven, and I think that 7-Elevens are also a valid and worthy source of a poem. I try and make sure every YouTube video, every meme has equal chance as a star or a flower in my poem of I think everything in my life has the opportunity to become a poem. So finally, if we had the time to write those banana cards, those things on the sides, we would share some of our memory feasts with each other. What are the memories that are with food that are special, the foods that connect us with other people that are special to us, and we would share that. But instead, we'll just keep rolling along so I can wrap this up in a timely manner. So Kevin Young is a Topeka poet. He's a Kansas poet, and actually has an excellent poetry food anthology called The Hungry Ear, if you still want to keep nourishing yourself with food poems after this. And Kevin Young said, I think poems return us to that place of mud and dirt and earth, sun and rain, and that's where food comes from. And so there's this common link. So he said that in an interview about that anthology. So I'm going to go past his poem and end on his poem, but there is a slide, David, several slides forward, that has some statistics from Feeding America on hunger in Kansas. And the statistics for the whole state are 1 in 10 people face hunger, 1 in 7 children. And I looked up the statistics exactly for your county, for Shawnee County, and it was very similar. 10.5% of people in Shawnee County, 43% of people live below the SNAP threshold of 130% poverty. And so that's part of why I suggested, and Walt was happy to take up the call to bring food donations and ways to nourish each other physically. It can be hard to be spiritually nourished and intellectually nourished when we're not physically nourished. And so that's part of, when I get invited to do this talk, I often ask, can we make it a food drive as well? So we can, nourish both our bodies and our hearts in the same moment, or have it both be a part of it. So I will, if you also follow those memory card, recipe card directions, I think you do end up with a poem that is similar to the poem I'll end on. If we want to go back, we'll have to go back, David, because I skipped over Kevin Young's poem. So I think it'll be after Kevin Young's quote. There was a Kevin Young poem. So 2 more maybe slides forward. Yeah, there's his quote, and I think the poem kind of comes up next. But if you do go back and you follow some of those prompts, one of the things I always said at the top is to write "I want" and then start. So your little poetry lesson is that if you repeat a word or a phrase, often through a poem, it's called an anaphora. One of the lovely things about using that device is even if you leap around in your poem and what it's about, the "I want" will end up unifying things a little bit. So the prompt was half designed on the poems that we shared together and half designed to make the final recipe card poem that you would write if we had a little bit more time together. But Kevin Young's poem is called "Ode to the Midwest." So hopefully if you play around with your prompts, if you took pictures of those banana cards, will end up sounding somewhat like this closing poem, "Ode to the Midwest" by Kevin Young. And it's got an epigraph by Bob Dylan. "The country I come from is called the Midwest. I want to be doused in cheese and fried. I want to wander the aisles, my heart's supermarket stocked high as cholesterol. I want to die wearing a sweatsuit. I want to live forever in a Christmas sweater, a teddy bear nursing on the front. I want to write a check in the express lane. I want to scrape my driveway clean myself, early, before anyone's awake. That'll put 'em to shame. I want to see what the sun sees before it tells the snow to go. I want to be the only black person I know. I want to throw up my back and not complain about it. I want to drive 2 blocks. Why walk? I want love and stuff. I want to cut my sutures myself. I want to jog down to the river and make it my bed. I want to walk its muddy banks and make a withdrawal. I tried jumping in, found it frozen. I'll go home, I guess, to my rooms where the moon changes and shines like television." So that poem was by Kevin Young, a fantastic Kansas poet, though now he lives in New York. We still get to count him. And really quickly, we'll go, David, through just a few slides. There was one reminder I forgot to give that says highest need items at food banks. And one important thing, I talked to somebody who ran a food bank about these talks, and I said, what could I say? What would you want other people to know? And one of the most interesting things, she's like, we need can openers. Like, you can give all the canned food away that you want, but if they don't have a good way to open a can, that's not very helpful. Sometimes there's those pull tabs, but thinking about, that's great to give that, but then how is that food cooked? So thinking also about pots and pans, utensils, pot holders are also things that people need at food banks. But the can openers was pretty interesting. Also, there's not a lot of canned meats that are available for people who are hungry. And also some places, and you might want to check, but we'll do hygiene products. We both talked about the importance of clean socks and how meaningful that is to a lot of people, but also toothpaste, toothbrushes, deodorants, menstruation products. those kinds of things. So realizing when we think about food donations, we think about our cans, but we don't think about how do they open the cans, hygiene products that people might need, and some of the other factors that go into the non-food parts of things people might need at a food bank. And then on the last slide, this is just if you are interested at all, before TikTok gets banned, I am on TikTok making food poetry poems. And it's just at Poet Laureate of Kansas. Instagram is at Poet Laureate of Kansas with like a little underscore afterwards. And the videos end up both on both places. Instagram gets a little bit more content, and because I can do things besides videos. But you can watch me chop onions badly and read Pablo Neruda's poem about onions, or those kinds of things. Those are the kinds of little poetry videos I make. And then of course on Facebook, you'll see pictures of your room here today up there later. So if you want to hear more about poetry and follow along and, you know, again, mock my knife skills when I go after onions, you can find me on those social media platforms. But thank you again for having me here today to talk to you about food and poems. Again, if you have there are some short packets that were just the poems that we read aloud, but the longer packets have other poems should you want to nourish yourself more in that way. And if you were like, great, thanks, that was fine, but are not going to revisit the poems, I'll absolutely collect them later and use them again and recycle them if you don't want to take them home. But if you would and will use them elsewhere, please absolutely do. And if there's any other thing I could leave you with, it is, again, you do not solve for the lake. A poem is about being within it. I don't go to art galleries and I'm like, well, clearly the artist here in the 18th century meant for me to think about the role of the Catholic Church and whatever. Like, I don't think that stuff. I just go and look and enjoy it. So poems just require your presence, engagement with your senses if you can, and that it is meant to soothe and embolden the soul to accept the mystery. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tracy. That was a delight. She has given us a few minutes of talk back. If anybody has memories they'd like to share of cooking or food traditions or poems about that. I was intrigued by your interest in etymology. I just recently found out that the word company literally means to have bread with, as in empanadas or panniers or paneras. So if you have thoughts on food and poetry and memories, please share them with us. Remember that you will be recorded in perpetuity. Please introduce yourself and speak directly into the microphone.
Deb Bledsoe.
Close.
I flashed to the smell of clean sweat and beer, which is a warm, fuzzy blanket to me, which is bad when you're dating.
Hi, my name is Blair. Pronouns are he, they. My biggest memory with food is probably my favorite meal that my mom makes, which is cabbage soup, and it is potatoes and cabbage and sausage and onion. It is a very simple soup, but we make soup, so much soup when we make cabbage soup, enough to feed you for days level of cabbage soup. And that is the only meal to this day that I will eat leftovers of, or seconds or thirds or fourths.
Well, again, thank you. We'll close with my favorite food-related poem, also by Wendell Berry. Prayer After Eating. I have taken in the light that quickened eye and leaf. May my brain be bright with praise of what I eat in the brief blaze of motion and of thought. May I be worthy of my meat. So please join us for coffee and conversation and a chance to meet Tracy and have her sign your books.
Okay, the whole community needs to get involved with this. We need singers and we need percussionists. You can be both, but at least choose one, will you? It goes like this. Open the window, children. Open the window now. Open the window, children. Open the window, let the dove fly in. Open the window, let the dove fly in. Try with me. Open the window, children. Open the window now. Open the window, children. Open the window, let the dove fly in. Open the window, let the dove fly in. Mama and Papa are fighting like snakes. Open the window, let the dove fly in. Baby is crying like her heart will break. Open the window. Neighbors lock their doors, build fences so high. Can't see what's to discover on the other side. Here we go, percussionists. Open the window, children. Open the window now. Open the window, children. Open the window, let the dove fly in. Open the window, let the dove fly in. Borders round countries and borders round the sky. The only borders that close you are the borders round your mind. Some people have minds, some people have none. But what's the use of money if your heart's gone numb? Let's do it again. Here we go. Open the window, children. Open the window now. Open the window, children. Open the window, let the dove fly in. Open the window, let the dove fly in. This big old world is in a great mess. Open the window, find peace and rest. Open the window, children. Open the window now. Open the window, children. Last time. Open the window, let the dove fly in. Open the